I never thought my life's work would boil down to a war over snow. For 15 years, I've run a small but successful landscaping and snow removal business right here in the community of Oak Haven. It's a good life, an honest one. I trim hedges in the summer, rake leaves in the fall, and when the lake effect machine cranks up in the winter, I'm the guy who keeps the driveways clear and the roads passable. I always believed that being a good neighbor was just part of the job description, something you did without thinking, like breathing. Then Brenda moved in, and I learned that some people see a helping hand as a rule violation waiting to happen. Oak Haven was, for the most part, a live and let live kind of place. We had a homeowners association, but for years it was more of a social club that planned the annual 4th of July barbecue than a governing body. The dues were minimal, mostly covering the landscaping for the common areas and the little playground near the entrance. Old Mr. Henderson ran it for a decade with a light touch and a friendly wave. He'd remind you to trim a low-hanging branch with a gentle note tucked into your mailbox, not a certified letter threatening legal action. It was peaceful. It was reasonable. It was everything Brenda was not. She and her husband, a perpetually frowning man named Gary, bought the corner lot 2 years ago. Brenda had that specific kind of energy you can feel from across the street, a restless, simmering dissatisfaction with the world as it was. She saw chaos where the rest of us saw community. Within 6 months of moving in, she'd attended her first HOA meeting. Within a year, she'd leveraged a handful of proxies from new residents and a general sense of apathy from the rest of us to get herself elected president. Old Mr. Henderson just sighed and stepped aside, saying he was getting too old for the politics of it. We didn't know how right he was. The changes started small, like a slow-leaking faucet. First came the newsletter, a glossy, 4-page affair printed in a severe font, outlining a host of new regulations. Trash cans could no longer be visible from the street except on collection day. Holiday decorations had to be removed within 7 days of the holiday itself. All lawn ornaments, including the little ceramic gnomes a few of the older residents cherished, were suddenly deemed tacky and had to be approved by an architectural review committee, which, of course, she chaired. It was annoying, a low-grade hum of interference in our quiet lives, but most people just grumbled and complied. It was easier than fighting. My first real inkling of the trouble to come was a minor skirmish over my work truck. I'd always parked it in my driveway, a clean, well-maintained Ford F-350 with my company logo tastefully displayed on the doors. One afternoon, I found a notice slipped under my windshield wiper. It was a formal warning, citing a newly unearthed bylaw prohibiting commercial vehicles from being parked in driveways overnight. I read the thing twice, a knot of irritation tightening in my gut. I'd been parking my truck there for over a decade without a single complaint. I walked over to her house that evening, intending to have a reasonable conversation. Brenda opened the door before I even knocked, as if she'd been watching for me. She was a woman of medium height, with a haircut that looked like it had been styled with a ruler and a glare that could curdle milk. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone suggesting she very much doubted it. I held up the notice. "Brenda, it's about this. My truck. I've lived here for 15 years, and this has never been an issue." She crossed her arms, a thin, self-satisfied smile playing on her lips. "Well, it's an issue now. The bylaws are very clear. We must maintain the residential character of our community." I tried to reason with her, explaining that it was my livelihood, that I needed it ready to go for early morning snow calls. She was unmoved. "Rules are rules," she said, and then she closed the door in my face. That was the end of reason. For a while, I complied. I started parking the truck at a small commercial lot I rented a few miles away, a significant inconvenience that added time and expense to my workday. But the real conflict, the one that would consume our neighborhood for the next year, was delivered by the biggest blizzard we'd seen in a generation. The storm hit on a Friday night, a relentless wall of white that dumped nearly 3 feet of snow on us by Saturday morning. The world outside was silent, beautiful, and completely paralyzed. For me, a storm like this was go time. I was up before dawn, firing up the big plow on my truck. My first priority was always my contract clients, but Oak Haven was my home. I'd always done a neighborly pass, clearing the main road through our subdivision before the county plows ever got to us. It was something I did for free, just to make sure people could get out if they needed to, especially folks like the Millers in number 42. Mr. Miller was in his 80s and on oxygen, and his wife, Eleanor, couldn't handle a shovel anymore. I spent 2 hours clearing the main loop, carving a clean, wide path through the deep drifts. Then I did the Millers' driveway and walkway right up to their door. I was just finishing up, my breath pluming in the frigid air, when I saw her. Brenda was standing on her porch, wrapped in a pristine down coat, a mug of something steaming in her hands. She was watching me, her expression unreadable but radiating a cold intensity. I gave her a nod, the universal sign for good morning, crazy weather, She didn't nod back. She just stared. The confrontation came an hour later. I was back at my own house, shoveling my front walk, when she marched up my driveway, a clipboard clutched in her gloved hand. Her husband Gary trailed a few paces behind her, holding a tape measure and looking miserable. "We need to talk," she announced, her voice sharp enough to cut through the muffled silence of the snow-covered world. I leaned on my shovel. "Brenda, what can I do for you? You have violated Section 7, subsection C of the community bylaws," she said, tapping the clipboard with a perfectly manicured nail. "Snow removed from private driveways cannot be deposited on common property. You pushed snow from the Miller's driveway onto the grassy median across the street." I blinked, genuinely confused. "Brenda, it's 3 feet of snow. Where else is it supposed to go?" I piled it neatly on the median, out of the way of traffic and pedestrians. She shook her head, a grim little smile of triumph on her face. "The rule is explicit. It doesn't allow for exceptions based on volume. That snow is now the HOA's responsibility to remove, at a significant cost." I felt a surge of disbelief, so potent it was almost laughable. "Cost? It's snow. It will melt." I was helping an elderly couple who can't get out of their house. Behind her, Gary shuffled his feet, refusing to make eye contact. He just stared at the snowbank as if it held the secrets of the universe. "Your motives are irrelevant," Brenda snapped. "You used commercial equipment on a non-client's property without a work order submitted to the board, and you illegally dumped material on common ground. This is your official first warning. A second violation will result in a $200 fine." That was the moment something shifted inside me. The truck, the gnomes, the trash cans, that was all petty nonsense. This was different. This was punishing kindness. This was turning a community into a sterile collection of houses governed by nonsensical rules. "You're going to fine me for helping my neighbors in a blizzard?" I asked, my voice low and steady. "Are you serious?" She didn't flinch. "I am serious about upholding the standards of this community. You will receive a formal citation in the mail." She turned on her heel and marched away, Gary scurrying behind her like a shadow. I stood there in the snow, shovel in hand, and realized this was no longer a disagreement. This was a declaration of war. The citation arrived 2 days later, a crisp white envelope with the HOA's professionally printed logo. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic aggression, detailing my alleged infractions in cold, legalistic language. It even included a grainy, black and white photo of my plow truck near the Miller's driveway, with an arrow pointing to the offending pile of snow on the median. There was something odd about the photo, a faint smudge in the corner, but I dismissed it as a printing error. The letter informed me that a fine of $200 had been levied against my property. My first instinct was to ignore it, to treat it with the contempt it deserved. But then I saw Eleanor Miller struggling to get her mail. Her path was starting to drift over again, and she looked frail against the towering snowbanks. I knew Brenda's actions weren't just about me. They were about control, and people like the Millers were the ones who would suffer most under her regime. So, I paid the fine. I wrote the check, but in the memo line, I wrote, "For being a good neighbor." It was a small, petty act of defiance, but it made me feel slightly better. The winter continued its assault, and so did Brenda. Every time a significant snowfall occurred, I'd get out and clear the main road and help the handful of elderly or infirm residents who couldn't manage it themselves. And every time, like clockwork, a new citation would appear in my mailbox a few days later. The fines escalated, 200 became 400, then 800. Each citation came with another poorly printed photo, and each photo had that same strange smudge, a dark little swirl on the glossy paper. She started getting creative with the violations. One citation was for operating commercial machinery before 8 a.m., even though my contract with the city for emergency routes required me to be out by 5. Another was for altering the aesthetic landscape of a common area by creating a snow pile that was, in her opinion, excessively high. It became clear that she was watching me, documenting my every move, looking for any excuse to tighten the screws. The community, for the most part, remained silent. People would stop me at the mailbox and whisper their support, telling me Brenda was out of control, but no one wanted to be her next target. Fear is a powerful silencer. The conflict began to affect more than just my bank account. The letter carrier started skipping houses on days when the snow was heavy, complaining that the access wasn't clear enough since my unofficial plowing had stopped. A Meals on Wheels delivery for the Millers was cancelled for the same reason. Brenda's response, posted on the community bulletin board, was a masterclass in passive aggression. Residents are reminded to make their own arrangements for snow removal in accordance with HOA guidelines. The association is not responsible for disruptions to third-party services. In other words, you're on your own. The breaking point for me came in late February. We got another foot of snow overnight. I was under contract to clear a local medical clinic first thing, so I couldn't do my usual pass through the neighborhood. Around 9 in the morning, I got a frantic call from Eleanor Miller. Her husband was having trouble breathing, and she'd called for an ambulance, but the paramedics couldn't get their vehicle down the street because of a huge drift near the entrance. I dropped everything, raced back to the neighborhood in my plow truck, and cleared a path. The ambulance got through, and Mr. Miller was taken to the hospital. He was okay, thankfully, but the incident shook me to my core. That afternoon, I found another envelope taped to my front door. It wasn't just a citation, it was a formal notice of a lien being placed on my property for $3,200 in unpaid fines and legal fees. Tucked inside was a letter, personally signed by Brenda, informing me that my continued and flagrant disregard for community bylaws had left the board with no other choice. It stated that any further violations would result in foreclosure proceedings. She was trying to take my home. All because I shoveled snow for my neighbors. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table, the pile of citations spread out before me. My anger had cooled into a hard, cold resolve. This was no longer about snow or bylaws. It was about a bully who had taken control and was using her power to terrorize people. I looked closely at the photos again, one for each violation. They were all taken from roughly the same angle, probably from her living room window. And on every single one, in the bottom right corner, was that same greasy, whirled smudge. It looked like a fingerprint. I knew I was out of my depth. This wasn't a neighborhood squabble anymore, it was a legal battle. The next morning, I called a lawyer. Mr. Thompson was a semi-retired, no-nonsense attorney whose name I'd gotten from a client. He had a reputation for being a shark when it came to property law. I laid out the whole story in his dusty, book-lined office, finishing with the threat of foreclosure. He listened patiently, steepled his fingers, and looked at the stack of citations I'd brought with me. "Well," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You've got a classic case of a tyrannical HOA president on your hands. They're more common than you'd think. They get a little taste of power and it goes straight to their heads." He picked up one of the citations and examined the photo. "She's documenting everything, which is smart on her part, but it can also be a liability." He pointed to the smudge with the tip of his pen. "You mentioned this. You think it's a fingerprint?" I nodded. "It's on every single one." "Same spot," he grunted. "Could be. Or it could be a speck on her camera lens, or a glitch in her printer. On its own, it doesn't mean much. What we need to do is go through these bylaws with a fine-toothed comb. Bullies like this, they're often so focused on enforcing their favorite rules that they get sloppy with the ones that govern their own power." Mr. Thompson agreed to take my case. His advice was twofold. First, he would file a formal dispute of the lien, which would forestall any immediate foreclosure action. Second, he told me to formally request a complete copy of the HOA's financial records, meeting minutes, and all correspondence for the past 2 years. As a homeowner, I was legally entitled to them. She'll either refuse, which is illegal, or she'll hand over the rope she's tied her own noose with, he said with a grim smile. People like this are rarely as meticulous as they pretend to be. So began my investigation. I sent a certified letter to the HOA, formally requesting the documents. As expected, Brenda stonewalled. She replied with a letter stating that my request was overly broad and that the documents contained sensitive information. This was a predictable move, and Mr. Thompson was ready. He fired back with a letter of his own, citing the specific state statutes that required her to comply within 30 days or face legal penalties, both as a board and personally. The threat of personal liability seemed to do the trick. A week later, a large, begrudgingly packed box of documents landed on my porch. I spent the next 2 weeks buried in paper. Most of it was boring: invoices for lawn care, minutes from sparsely attended meetings, tedious back and forths about what color to paint the sign at the entrance. But slowly, a few things started to stand out. I noticed a series of invoices from a company I'd never heard of, Precision Surveying and Compliance, for property line verification and a violation documentation services. The charges were exorbitant, thousands of dollars over the last year. The address listed for the company was a post office box in the next town over. I also noticed that all communication from the board, the warnings, the newsletters, the citations, was now being sent via a courier service instead of the regular mail, at a cost of $20 per delivery. This was how she was justifying the legal fees she'd tacked onto my fines. It was a transparently vindictive way to inflate the costs for anyone who dared to cross her. She was using our own HOA dues to fund her personal crusade. My ally in all of this was, surprisingly, old Mr. Henderson. I went to see him one afternoon, laying out what I'd found. He wasn't surprised. He'd seen the direction Brenda was heading from the beginning. "That woman," he said, shaking his head slowly. "She's got a spirit of pure vinegar. Never seen anything like it." He told me about her husband, Gary. He used to be a land surveyor for the county before he retired, Mr. Henderson said. Always tinkering in his garage. Thinks he's some kind of expert on everything. The pieces clicked into place with an audible snap. Precision Surveying and Compliance. The expert documentation. Gary. I pulled out my phone and did a quick search for the company. Nothing. No website, no business license, no registration with the state. The company didn't exist. It was a shell, a fiction created to funnel HOA money into their own pockets. Brenda was having her husband, Gary, generate fake invoices for the work he did taking pictures of my plow truck from their window. This was the leverage Mr. Thompson had been talking about. This wasn't just a case of an overzealous HOA president anymore. This was fraud. Embezzlement. I called Mr. Thompson immediately, my heart pounding with a mixture of rage and vindication. He was ecstatic. "We've got her," he said, his voice buzzing with energy. "This is it. But we can't just accuse her. We need to present this in a way that leaves her no room to wiggle. The annual HOA meeting is next month. That's our stage. The final piece of the puzzle, the one that would turn this from a solid case into an airtight one, was the fingerprints. The smudges on the photos had been bothering me, a loose thread I couldn't stop pulling. On a hunch, I took one of the citations to a friend of mine who worked in law enforcement. I asked him if there was any way to tell if the smudge was, in fact, a fingerprint. He looked at it under a magnifying glass. "It's hard to say for sure without proper equipment," he said. "But it's definitely a print. Looks like it was made in ink, maybe from handling a newspaper or a stamp pad, and then transferred to the photo paper. An ink pad." The thought sparked another memory. In the box of HOA documents, I'd found a new, official-looking stamp that Brenda had apparently commissioned. It had the HOA logo and read official violation notice. She was likely stamping the citations, and Gary, in his haste or sloppiness, was handling the photos with inky fingers. It was circumstantial, but it painted a picture of a shoddy, arrogant operation. It was the detail that made the whole scheme feel real and visceral. Armed with this discovery, our strategy shifted from defense to offense. Mr. Thompson advised me to stop fighting the individual citations for now. Let her think she's winning, he said. Let her get cocky. We're not just trying to get your fines dropped. We're aiming for a complete removal of the board and potential criminal charges for the next few weeks. I laid low. I hired a local kid to shovel the Miller's Walk, paying him out of my own pocket. I parked my truck off-site. I gave Brenda no new ammunition. Her victory must have seemed absolute. Meanwhile, Mr. Thompson and I prepared for the annual meeting. He drafted a detailed presentation outlining the financial misconduct, the shell company, the fraudulent invoices, and the conflicts of interest. We made copies of the invoices, the bank statements showing the checks cashed by Precision Surveying, and the state business registry showing the company didn't exist. I also reached out to a few of my neighbors who had privately expressed their frustration, including the family who had been forced to remove their daughter's cheerfully painted birdhouse. I showed them what I had found. Their quiet anger quickly turned into a willingness to act. Word began to spread. The night of the annual meeting, the community center's meeting room was packed. In previous years, you'd be lucky to get a dozen people to show up. Tonight, there were over 100. Every seat was taken, and people were standing along the walls. The air was thick with tension. Brenda sat at the head table, flanked by her two board cronies, looking smug. She clearly interpreted the large turnout as a sign of her successful leadership, a community finally engaged in her vision of order. Gary was in the front row, looking as sour as ever. Brenda opened the meeting with a glowing report on the HOA's financial health, praising the board's fiscally responsible management and their proactive enforcement that had, she claimed, increased property values. Then she opened the floor for new business. This was our cue. I stood up, and Mr. Thompson stood with me. "Madam President," I said, my voice ringing out in the silent room. "My name is Mark, and I'm a homeowner. And this is my legal counsel, Mr. Thompson. We have some serious concerns regarding the board's financial activities and enforcement procedures." A murmur went through the crowd. Brenda's smile faltered, replaced by a mask of cold fury. "This is not the proper forum for personal grievances," she said sharply. "If you have an issue with your fines, you can submit it in writing." Mr. Thompson stepped forward. "With all due respect, Madam President, this is not a personal grievance. This is a matter of potential fraud, embezzlement of HOA funds, and malfeasance by the board. And under the bylaws, this is precisely the forum for it." He placed a thick file on the table in front of her. "I believe every homeowner here will be interested in the activities of a company called Precision Surveying and Compliance." At the mention of the name, I saw a flicker of panic in Gary's eyes. He sank lower in his chair. Brenda, however, held her ground. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she said, her voice laced with disdain. "That is one of our most trusted vendors. They provide essential documentation services." Mr. Thompson smiled, a predator's smile. "Do they? Because according to the state, Precision Surveying and Compliance doesn't exist. There is no business license. No tax ID. No record of it anywhere. It is, for all legal purposes, a ghost." He then projected the first slide onto the screen at the front of the room. It was a copy of an invoice from the Phantom Company for $2,000 for violation documentation. The next slide was a copy of the check from the HOA's bank account, made out to the company. The final slide in the series was a copy of the endorsed check, deposited into a personal bank account. An account in the name of Gary, her husband. The room erupted. People were shouting, pointing. The facade of order Brenda had so carefully constructed shattered in an instant. Brenda was on her feet, her face pale. "This is slander. These documents are fake," she shrieked. But the evidence was undeniable. Mr. Thompson calmly walked the audience through a dozen more such transactions, totaling over $20,000 of our money that had been funneled directly into her husband's pocket. It was money paid for photos Gary took from his own window of his own neighbors. Money that was then used to levy fines and place liens on those same neighbors. Then came the final blow. I stepped forward. "Brenda, for months, you've been sending me these," I said, holding up the stack of citations. "And on every single photo, there's a little smudge. A fingerprint." I looked directly at Gary. "I wonder whose fingerprint it is." Perhaps that expert who was providing these documentation services was a little careless. Maybe he had ink on his hands from the official violation stamp the board bought. Gary went white as a sheet. He looked like he was going to be sick. Brenda's authority crumbled completely. Her two board members, who had looked uncomfortable throughout the presentation, now looked terrified. They began backing away from her, both literally and figuratively. "I had no knowledge of this," one of them stammered. The other just shook his head, looking at the floor. Brenda stood alone, sputtering, her eyes darting around the room, finding only a sea of angry, betrayed faces. She tried to adjourn the meeting, banging her gavel, but her voice was lost in the noise. Someone in the back of the room had already called the police. Two sheriff's deputies arrived just as the meeting descended into complete chaos. Mr. Thompson calmly handed them a neatly organized folder containing all the evidence we had presented. They spoke with Brenda and Gary for a few minutes, their conversation quiet but tense. Then, to the astonishment of everyone in the room, they placed both of them in handcuffs. The sight of Brenda, the petty tyrant of Oak Haven, being led out of the community center in police custody was something none of us would ever forget. It was a stunning, almost surreal end to her reign of terror. The aftermath was swift and decisive. With the evidence we provided, the district attorney had an open and shut case. Brenda and Gary were charged with multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. They pleaded guilty to avoid a trial, hoping for leniency. The judge was not impressed. He lectured them for 10 minutes on the abuse of trust and the corrosion of community, calling their actions a despicable perversion of civic duty. Brenda was sentenced to 2 years in state prison. Gary, due to his more direct role in the financial fraud, got 3. They were also ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA for every dollar they had stolen. My own vindication was just as complete. The court ordered all fines, fees, and liens initiated by Brenda's board to be immediately nullified. The $3,200 lien on my house vanished. The money I had paid in fines was returned to me from the restitution funds. My name was cleared, but more importantly, my reputation as a good neighbor was restored. I was suddenly, and somewhat uncomfortably, a local hero. People I barely knew would stop me to shake my hand and thank me for standing up to her. With Brenda and her cronies gone, the HOA was in shambles. A special election was called to form a new board. This time, people were paying attention. The meeting to elect the new members was just as packed as the one where Brenda was dethroned, but the atmosphere was completely different. It was hopeful, constructive. They elected Mr. Henderson to come out of retirement and serve as interim president, a decision met with a standing ovation. He immediately spearheaded a complete overhaul of the bylaws, striking out all of Brenda's petty and punitive additions. The new rules were simple, based on common sense and mutual respect. The era of the Architectural Review Committee and the war on garden gnomes was over. The community began to heal. The oppressive atmosphere of suspicion and fear lifted, replaced by the quiet, comfortable cooperation we had known before. Neighbors started talking to each other again. The 4th of July barbecue that year was the best attended in recent memory. I went back to my life, plowing snow and mowing lawns, happy to fade back into the background. The only difference was that now, when I did my neighborly pass after a snowstorm, people would come out of their houses to wave, sometimes bringing me a hot cup of coffee. It felt good. It felt right. A couple of years passed. Oak Haven was thriving. Property values were actually up, not because of draconian rule enforcement, but because it was once again known as a friendly, desirable place to live. The HOA was solvent, transparent, and blessedly boring. The newsletters were simple, one-page announcements about potlucks and reminders to be safe on Halloween. It was perfect. One afternoon, I was at the local grocery store, picking up a few things for dinner, when I saw her. It was Brenda. She had been released from prison a few months earlier, I'd heard. She looked diminished. Her hair was no longer a perfect helmet, it was graying and unkempt. The sharp, imperious set of her shoulders had slumped. She was thinner, and the fire in her eyes had been replaced by a weary sort of emptiness. She was standing in the canned goods aisle, staring at a display of green beans as if it were the most complicated problem in the world. Our eyes met for a brief moment. I saw a flash of recognition, followed by shame. She quickly looked away, grabbing a can at random and moving to put it in her cart. I expected to feel a surge of triumph, or at least a grim satisfaction. But I didn't. I just felt a quiet sense of pity. Her quest for absolute control had cost her everything, her home, her freedom, her reputation. She and Gary had been forced to sell their house to pay the restitution and legal fees. They now lived in a small apartment on the other side of town. She was just another face in the crowd, a ghost of the tyrant she once was. I finished my shopping and walked out into the sunshine. I got into my truck, the same one she had tried to banish, and drove home. As I pulled into my neighborhood, I saw the Millers sitting on their front porch, waving as I passed. I saw kids riding their bikes and the infamous birdhouse, now proudly reinstalled in my neighbor's yard. Everything was as it should be. Looking back, the whole bizarre episode taught me a valuable lesson. It's easy for good people to become complacent, to assume that reason and decency will always prevail on their own. But sometimes, they don't. Sometimes, a bully steps into a vacuum of power, and the only way to stop them is to stand up and say, "No more." It's not about fighting over snow or the placement of a trash can. It's about defending the very idea of community itself against those who would twist rules into weapons and poison neighborly trust for their own petty satisfaction. My war with Brenda wasn't a war I ever wanted to fight, but winning it gave our quiet little corner of the world back its peace. And for that, I'd fire up the plow all over again.